Well, it's good as a curator to give a walkthrough talk because, of course, well, it was my idea to have the show in the first place. So you may say, why drawing? Why Pre-Raphaelites? Because drawing is very important to the Pre-Raphaelites as part of a debate about originality, the rejection of what had gone before in British art and indeed in European academic art, and as a way of trying to formulate what would be an alternative. So the Pre-Raphaelites, who are very famous for their paintings, and I know that many of you will remember those paintings very vividly, you'll know the characteristics of those paintings, and often they're very much to do with some of the attributes of painting, like bright colour. So drawing doesn't seem to be at all important to the Pre-Raphaelites. And I'm here to tell you tonight, if this doesn't sound too much like a revivalist meeting, I'm here to tell you tonight that drawing is very important. And actually, we'll see that this really is, the art of drawing is the first seeds of disaffection with academic conventions in British art. It starts with the Pre-Raphaelites emulating a particular kind of drawing that we associate with Romanticism. Do you know this term, Romanticism in European art? Something really from the very early 19th century, in fact, even the end of the 18th century, which itself was about breaking academic conventions. Those academic conventions are very hard to break. And we might say that they lasted in all art schools from Australia to North America, working diagonally across Europe, right up through to the mid-20th century. Now, this romantic drawing that was being practiced amongst a select few was really to do with outline, of rendering the subject in the very, very most austere kind of linear conformation. So everything was stressed to be in line. We've got an example here of Millet working as a child, really. He was a child prodigy. So we are very lucky to have unearthed some of his juvenilia, and this is one of them, and it shows very much how he was adept at doing this very difficult thing of rendering the whole world in line. And when he came to join the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, which was in 1848, he was a student at the Royal Academy, and he had already shown his prowess as a draftsman. He was winning prizes in a very strict academic style of drawing, mainly from casts of antique, ancient sculpture. And yet, when he joins the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the first sign of this rebellion is in a drawing like this, Lovers by a Rose Bush. It's intensely spiky, fine, linear, and it's also a reference to medieval culture, and not really medieval religious culture, but medieval poetic culture, the poetry of love, which the Brotherhood found endemic in all of their, well, as far as it went, medieval researches. One of the key works that we're seeing here is actually Millet's drawings for his famous work, now in the Tate, of Ophelia. Ophelia in her death agonies as she drowns, having committed suicide following her rejection by Hamlet. Now, why should I point this out? Well, apart from the fact there's the sheer virtuosic quality of this beautiful drawing of the head of Elizabeth Siddal, the model for the figure of Ophelia, there's also this sense in which we've got very young artists struggling with, engaging with, and trying to realize ideas from the highest level of literature. And that is an extraordinary achievement, because what Millet has done here is take something that doesn't actually happen in the play, it actually happens off stage. Someone refers to the death of Ophelia. And this is an imagination of what this offstage event would be. And the other thing to point out here, actually in many of these drawings, is that what they develop is very important for later developments in Pre-Raphaelite painting. And that is, they see essentially art as being about a single figure and its relationship to interior thought, or two figures related to some very deep emotional dialogue. Now, academic art hadn't worked like that. It had worked mainly on the idea of history painting, which was elaborate groupings of figures in very dramatic and often dramatized through gesture, very dramatic engagements with each other. It often makes academic history painting seem a little bit ludicrous. So one of the things that strikes us about these is actually their naturalism, the way in which these profoundly poetic and dramatic subjects seem actually quite natural. They're focused on this one person and their thoughts about something. It's a very great achievement, and it's a very new achievement, almost bringing some of the art of portraiture, the intimacy of portraiture, into what would have been a dramatic historical painting. You will, of course, have noticed I haven't mentioned nature, and in talking about the Millet Ophelia painting, in terms of that beautiful head and the interesting and never before seen drawing of Ophelia's body in the water, I haven't mentioned what is so striking in the painting, all those flowers, all those bulrushes, all that willow and its leaves and its bark and the wildlife in it. Well, that's because that is a separate branch of Pre-Raphaelitism that is really a product of an engagement with a contemporary critic and his works. John Ruskin, who we see here in this lovely watercolour by a very late follower of the Pre-Raphaelites, Fairfax Mirring. Ruskin, I'm sure you will know, was actually a gentleman, a well-off young gentleman who was a student of Oxford, and in fact his first major work, was published anonymously as a graduate of Oxford. That was Modern Painters, and in that book he put forward an idea that modern painting, particularly modern British painting, this was before the Pre-Raphaelites, 1843, was superior to that of the old masters because it was more accurate in treating nature. Now, Ruskin himself had been trained as an amateur artist, and so we see in some of these watercolours, particularly this, the way in which he was influenced deeply by current British practice in watercolour. And as an amateur work, is a very strikingly adept landscape watercolour. And you can see very clearly the influence of Turner, his great hero. He got to know Turner, and Modern Painters really is an argument that Turner is the greatest modern painter and outdoes all other painters before him of landscape. Now, you may think that this kind of painting has nothing to do with the precision and accuracy of Pre-Raphaelitism, and it's something which confuses many people. And of course, it is because really the Pre-Raphaelitism that we know comes from this collision of rejecting the academic drawing standards of the Royal Academy, which we've seen the Pre-Raphaelites do, them turning away from that into a very precise, linear delineation of poetic and dramatic subject. That collision with a Ruskinian theory about truth to nature. Ruskin himself declared that after he has this kind of moment of clarity later in his life, he says he realized by looking at a piece of ivy that he had never, in all his art lessons, been taught to look at anything. What he'd been taught, and this is what the Pre-Raphaelites had already arrived at about the treatment of the human body, was to conventionalize it. In other words, to follow rules about it, which meant all you ended up was learning how to draw like other people drew, not learning how to see. So this little section, it's a very beautiful, if very little section, is to do with looking. So what we find is chiefly characteristic about this kind of Ruskinian Pre-Raphaelitism, we might just coin it for the moment, is that it's about very precise rendering of bits of nature. And in the catalogue I talk about this idea of why these are little fragments of nature. Partly because, if you think about it, painting a whole painting like Millet's Ophelia in this sense of detail would take forever. And it's one of the reasons why actually the Pre-Raphaelites themselves abandon that very close attendance to nature after about 5 years of practice. It becomes exhausting. And also, of course, they're working at a time when photography is developing. And interestingly, when works like this by John Brett were shown, the artist Brett was described as having eyes like photographic lenses. This must have been one of the first times when it was possible to say about an artist that they were so faithful in reproduction that they were like a photographic lens. So these interesting parallel history between how science and technology is also beginning to represent nature. The pencil of nature, of course, as photography was known. So it's no coincidence they're happening at exactly the same time. And we've deliberately not shown major artists here in their own right. These are people who are following Ruskin. They were actually taking a Ruskinian line. And this line, you can see, often affects artists who were to become more major artists, people like Albert Moore, for instance, who became very closely identified with a kind of Whistlerian aesthetic movement painting. Or Frederick Sands, and we've here got a study of an ivy stump, almost as a kind of reference to Ruskin's interest in ivy and undergrowth, and how he incorporates it in an illustration for the popular press. These are people who take Ruskin's writings because they are so widely spread amongst Victorian society. Lots of people are reading these. These are artists saying, right, let's look the way Ruskin is asking us to look. And Ruskin himself formulated his thoughts on drawing in a book called The Elements of Drawing, which starts with the idea of not drawing, looking, and that's a very radical thing to do. Don't look at the conventions, look at the thing in front of you. Two important things actually happen at this point. One is that, as we can see, a kind of high Pre-Raphaelitism has developed, and this kind of painting from Arthur Hughes, I think, will be very familiar to you. It's a little like, is it not, the Ophelia of Millet. It even has some of the same kinds of motifs. And you can see how this Ruskinian Pre-Raphaelitism of precise truth to nature is being worked out. The ivy crawling up the bark, the rose petals, all of it beautifully done. And we are lucky in Birmingham not only to have the painting, but have two studies for the figure. And actually, these drawings reveal that the long engagement started off as a Shakespearean subject. I think it's from As You Like It. And the two figures are engaged in a kind of theatrical discussion, rather like Claudio and Isabella in The First Room by Hunt. But gradually, and this is something that happens to Pre-Raphaelite art in the 1850s, becomes more and more involved with modern subject matter. And for many of these subjects, it was about human beings and their relationships within the modern conditions of mid-Victorian industrial capitalist society. And often that was how it affects women, how that society militated against women, it hemmed them in, it made them subject to law in certain ways. This is, I think, a very, very interesting thing. We think perhaps typify the Pre-Raphaelites a little bit as making idols of women, of of having these kind of empty pictures about femininity. Actually, these are very concerned with the real conditions that women lived in. Women who, with their husbands, were having to leave the country to the unknown and frightening land of Australia. I wonder what ever happened to Australia. Did it ever take off? I don't think so. It sounds improbable to me. Anyway, now you're used to seeing the painting of this, and of course it's how Ford Madox Brown developed the kind of history painting we saw in Chaucer, his Chaucer subject, into modern life subject. And I actually think that this is very similar to some of those couples and some of those figure groupings in Chaucer. It's worth comparing the two. But clearly this is how he's working out the final composition. And it's a very instructive thing because he chooses this round pattern for the composition. One of the hardest things that an artist can do is fit in a complex figure grouping into a circle. So he needs to do drawings for it. This is very, very much towards the end of that process, but it's very instructive to see how an artist deals with circles. And one of the things I point out in the catalogue is the way in which circles are endemic within the structure, that circles within circles within circles, and so one might think of this, as the artist did, as a circle of love, rather like the Holy Family, the great staples of Renaissance painting. And if this is the Holy Family, then perhaps they're fleeing from oppression, as the Holy Family did in the flight into Egypt. So it's a very profound reflection, really, on modern life. In this wall, we can see actually how some of those ideas that we've already touched on, particularly the idea of the single figure and the single head as being the point of art, we see it worked out here in this very beautiful drawing by Rossetti of Jane Morris, used as a symbolic head of the mother of all the muses, Mnemosyne. Rossetti's work becomes repetitive, almost stereotypical, and that, I think, is the important, interesting thing for us. He returns constantly, over and over again, to the same subject, a woman's head. Now, I don't think this is reductive. I think what he's talking about is a kind of infinity that you get from contemplating this sort of subject. When you look at it, you get engaged. It becomes a kind of contemplative object. And other examples of the new rediscovery of mythic imagery, which is tantalizingly close to what we might call European symbolism, particularly in the work of Frederick Sands, whom we saw earlier was very interested in close observation of nature. He also became very interested in the single female head. And here he draws the thing that is undrawable, that is unlookable at, the head of Medusa. So although these are strikingly beautiful, I think that we have to see that actually there is something that's actually confrontational about them. They're often about very uncomfortable subjects. And in this case, E.R. Hughes, the nephew of Arthur Hughes, depicts what is really essentially an almost life-size corpse lying in a ditch. It's from a poem by Christina Rossetti, which Sands had originally illustrated when it was first brought out, this poem. It's an extraordinarily sort of corrupt image, and yet it has some of that early Pre-Raphaelite feeling about it. The roses that shower over Ophelia as she's lying dying in her stream. Now, one of the things I wanted to do in the show was also to see how Pre-Raphaelitism was disseminated not through what we could see as unique and individual fine art drawings, but actually how those drawings could be multiplied and replicated and reproduced in book illustration. Now, the Pre-Raphaelites had found an interest in print, in graphics, in illustration very, very early on. The one thing that could be seen as a kind of organ of their or sort of printed manifesto was their production of a magazine, unpromisingly called The Germ. And The Germ was always accompanied by, or always in its short life, by an engraved or etched illustration. And this was actually a very interesting thing because etching wasn't widely used. You can see the way in which they're tentatively using etching as a way of duplicating and multiplying drawings. Now, one of the things that happens is that the kind of objects and clothing even that filter into those designs stimulate the growth of what we now comfortably know as the arts and crafts movement. And much of the rest of this room is about that. How drawing of objects, clothes, patterns, accoutrements, let's call them that, accoutrements, actually becomes a reality. And it's an extraordinary history of how some students get together and decide we're going to make our own furniture, we're going to paint our own rooms. And this becomes an alternative movement in the history of visual culture in Britain, Europe, and in the rest of the world.